You know, that's like just your opinion, man.
So it is.
Oh, sorry.
Go.
I'm supposed to start. I had the video in my ear twice, and I got confused. So, welcome to the Audio Opinion Show, where a bunch of people who do shows for a living screw up the intro. That's what we do. It's our favorite.
Folk.
It's our favorite part of the show. I'm very glad that my co-host Andy Broughton is here to screw up. No, he didn't screw it up. It was me. But I'm joined by an array of audio professionals, some of whom I have nothing but respect for, some of whom I am very dubious. So we will see what the conversation looks like. But basically, the whole shtick of this show is that we get together and we swap our useless opinions about things until we get tired, and then we leave. So far, we've built an audience of 2s and 3s and sometimes 4s. So we're feeling pretty positive about our ratings so far.
Mostly
of all
bots.
the audio opinions, yeah, mostly bots. Of all the audio opinion shows on the internet, ours is by far the most popular. Anyway, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. If you're joining this later, then you can't talk back to us. But otherwise, feel free to stick stuff in the YouTube chat. I'll probably not look at it, but you can. So let's get this started with the polls. First, we poll people. So let me put up the right one. And it is, of course, what is the most important question? I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. And because many of you can't see the poll, I will go ahead and read it for you. The question is, how long did Wesley, capital W, spend preparing for the, quote, Battle of Wits, unquote? Most important question. So far, we have one person who's like, who? So you're on the wrong show. Choice number 1 is 2 months. Choice number 2 is 1 year. Choice number 3 is 2 years. Choice number 4 is who? And choice number 5 is Wallace Shawn, because Wallace Shawn is always an option every single time I ask the most important question. Vote
Brian,
early, vote awesome. Yes.
Hey, Brian, can you unco-host me so I can vote?
Oh, yeah. No, that's the most important thing in the entire thing is that Andy gets to vote.
I don't know, Brian. You didn't have an F, all the above, so I had to take a stab at it.
There you go. Wait, there it is. Withdrawal. Poof. There we go. Okay. So now you should be able to vote, Andy. Did I vote? I just did. So
I voted
twice. I know what my vote is. Now everybody's going to know what my vote was. So, all right. I feel like we're there. It's, the most important question, but we don't spend forever on it. So I'll share the results, and it would appear that the winner is Wallace Shawn, which absolutely gives an indication of what the quality of this conversation is going to be. Since the question was how long, and the answer is Wallace Shawn. The actual answer, it's not a trick question, is 2 years. He spent 2 years. Exactly what the quote is, but anyway, he made himself immune to iocane powder so that he could be ready for the Battle of Wits. That's the most important question.
The only thing I got right all day. The only thing I got right all day.
All right, so that was useless and dumb, and let's see if we can do more of that. Let's see. All right, so now we're going to choose our topic of the day. Our topic of the day, I'm launching it. Away we go. So what's our topic for the day? Choice number 1. How much do you think that confirmation and other biases affect what we hear? I keep asking this question because I think it's a cool question. Number 2, what's your opinion on gain sharing? Number 3, what do you think the next game-changing tech is? We've answered that before, but it's a different group of people, different answers. And number 4, let's talk console user interface. What do we like, and why do we like it? Vote early, vote often. Well, vote once, because that's what you're allowed to do. We need to get some Jeopardy music, Andy, or something, or I need to sing do-do-do-do-do-do-do.
It's on my instant replay, but the instant replay is buried under a bunch of stuff over there.
It's still working?
And the question number 5 is going to be, who remembers what an instant replay
is? Who still owns one or has one?
It still owns one, exactly.
There's actually a couple of them buried over there, and they both have their Jeopardy on them.
Yeah, I very much remember that you pretty much can't get through a week of or a year of corporates without doing at least one.
They just introduced a new instant replay, and it's way improved.
Well, that wasn't hard to do.
No, I think the instant replay is the best user interface of any playback machine on the planet.
I don't disagree with you on that, and that's why on the next show I'm going to add that topic. What do you think the best instant replay interface is? But anyway, I think everybody's voted, so let's end the poll. We're going to share the results, and it looks like the winner for tonight is: how much do you think that confirmation and other biases affect what we hear? Which I think is a great question. That's why I keep asking it. So I think it will have great conversations. And the first person I'm going to
we can help you pick out your $500 large diaphragm condenser vocal mic. See, because confirmation bias actually enters into that. Like, we know the Shure is going to sound good.
Information bias a thing?
Yeah, probably. So does anybody want to step into this, or should I just make Andy Broughton start?
Well, first explain what it is. I think I know what it is, but I might have some bias about defining that word. So term, but I think it would make sense.
Right. Okay, fair enough. So if you look up, and this is a good Wikipedia rabbit hole for anybody to get into, but if you just look up like biases, there's a list of like 47 like just established like natural human biases that we, in different amounts all bring to the table. Confirmation bias is one of the most common ones. It's just basically we walk into something with a certain belief set and we really want it to be true. And so then we tend to see the evidence that makes it true and kind of ignore the evidence that makes it false. And that's, I think, when I see a lot of very strong opinions in the audio field, I think that a lot of confirmation bias is going on that we don't necessarily want to admit to ourselves. But there's other biases, just general things of I think speakers should be black. And so, you end up with a speaker that's a different color and you're like, oh, that's weird. And instantly it's going to sound different because it just feels odd to you, or any number of things. And the most important thing to know about bias, it's not the same thing as prejudice or opinion. It's something that's going on inside of you that you're not necessarily aware of, that drives the way that you perceive things. So that's basically the definition. So now that I've defined the terms, does anybody want to step into how much do you think this actually matters? How objective do you think we actually are?
I'll
go.
Oh,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Carl, go.
Yeah. All right.
After you.
Well, one thought that pops into my head is it depends a little bit on your position. You're in the hierarchy. Let's take, for example, a newbie showing up and they hear the sound system and they think, this is a great sound system. The mixer is great. It must sound good. And they'll tell themselves that, even if there's something really wrong with the sound. And then you could reverse that and say, the veteran mixer has developed relationships with manufacturers and certain styles of setting up the gear and mixing. And so to them, that sounds good, whatever that is. And they would never think of replacing a mic or a preamp or, a type of speaker without like a huge differential or something really, that's going to open their eyes, which is hard to do. They get set in their ways. So that's a couple thoughts about this, but I think it's very, very real. People get used to a certain sound and don't realize that there might be a better way. And they're limiting themselves by not having an open mind. And again, unconsciously in a lot of cases.
What do you think? If pointing not to pick on you, Carl, but welcome back. And you have such a lovely voice. Can you point to anything you think anything that's happened to you where you feel like, later on you looked back and went, I may have been like, I can think of times for me, but I don't know if like a particular piece of gear or something that you use that you were, as someone who works specifically with a certain manufacturer, do you feel like then when you are confronted with other manufacturers' gear that there's a certain amount of just natural, like, oh, their engineering decisions were interesting and strange, and I don't know how I feel about those.
I think it has. First I was going to say, oh no, that's never happened to me, but no, I think it has. We get to like certain things, and I guess my example might be recordings I've done. Because that becomes a fixed thing. You go back and listen to it, and it's like, wow, I thought this was great at the time, and now it's horrible. Or, you could see the other way around. Like, I was never happy with this. And then you listen to it 10 years later, like, wow, this is pretty damn good. But, the more common is that you think it's great when it's happening. And then later on, you're like, wow, I never noticed that the Rhodes piano has a distortion on it. You're so in it at the time that you miss that. Or a certain kind of mic that you just couldn't live without, or had to be the mic, and you're hearing it now and you're like, wow, why did I ever choose that? That's definitely happened to me.
Well, and how many times have we had, like, especially when we were coming up, we're all like, I see a lot of gray hair here, a lot of gray hair and a lot of no hair. So, I'm making value judgments, but also, like, early in our career, like, the first sound company that I went to work for had a ton of Sennheiser mics, none of which I'd worked with before. And some very particular Beyer dynamic mics, none of which I'd ever seen before. And in particular, like, they had a bunch of Sennheiser ME40 small diaphragm, kind of a standard pencil mic. And I'd never used them before. They looked weird to me, and they looked cheap. Like, that was my perception. Like, this kind of looks cheap and junky. And some of it was they were beat up. But they all said, these are really good. So I used them. And suddenly, like, they got really, really good, because they were like, this is a really good mic and they sound really good. And I was like, well, I guess they sound good, or they wouldn't have bought them. So I guess they're good. And, I'm just being honest. Like, I before that, I was like SM81 or nothing. Like, that was my standard. And, and then the next time I had access to an SM81, I was like, kind of run of the mill. Like, that Sennheiser's got a thing to it. That was probably all crap. Like, everything that happened was probably completely just me. Yeah.
Sennheiser makes some really fantastic mics. If it begins with an ME, that's not one of them.
Whoa!
Oof! Shots fired.
Yeah.
Brian, to speak to that though, I think you're selling yourself short a bit, because you have the gray hair. You survived in this industry for 16 weeks or however long it's been, and
20.
Give yourself some credit for having some ears. And I've used SM81s. I can't recall using ME40, so I can't personally offer an opinion about it. But I remember going from like 451s to SM81s to 460s, whatever, and you go, oh yeah, okay, I get, this definitely does something that doesn't do, or whatever, and the whole thing about this whole discussion about confirmation bias, which is where I was going to come in the first place, is that it kind of takes experience out of the equation, and it's because and for certainly for in Karl's example of the young newbie that shows up at a gig and sees the name of a speaker manufacturer emblazoned on the side or the front of the speakers, and go, oh, those are good, I heard those are good. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of confirmation bias, because they're not maybe trained to distinguish what they're hearing, but they see the name and it says this, so it must be good, even if it sounds like crap. So, but once you get past that, once you actually learn how to listen, then you can convince yourself of anything. But also, I think if you hear the difference between a good large diaphragm condenser mic and a cheap knockoff, and you go, yeah, I hear that, so I think there's a to just put it in one camp or the other, confirmation bias or not, is a little bit extreme.
Go ahead, Clive, because I knew Clive would have something smart to say. Go, Clive.
We hope. I think the point about confirmation bias is something that goes away with experience as well, in that, Peter's shaking his head. I think it can go away. Like I run into people who absolutely insist they must use this microphone or this desk. And yet, as people get more experience and use a wide variety of gear, I find that they'll go, oh, this one or that one, as long as it's in the realm of a decent quality product, they'll use whatever's available. And I think that's training and experience and listening skill, as opposed to just bringing an opinion to the table.
Oh, come on. We're all about opinions here. And so this is my opinion, is I think that, and since we're kind of focusing on confirmation bias because it's an easy one to kind of wrap our head around, which I'm fine with. I think that both can be true. I think that early in our career, we can have certain biases based on what the cool kids told us was going to be the thing, or what the sales guy told us can be the thing. I remember 150 years ago when I was first coming up, the sales guy was like, these ND757, EV ND757's the greatest vocal mic ever, and like held it next to an SM58 and like, look how much high end it is. And I was like, this is the greatest mic ever. And I bought it and I used it for like 3 years or whatever when I was playing music. And then after I started getting involved in actually doing pro sound, I circled back and like found my old 757 and plugged it in and was like, this thing sounds terrible. Absolutely terrible. But I had like bought into what the salesman had told me. But I also know that I have some, and I can give you a really clear example. I am totally biased against Soundcraft mixing consoles. And I know why. It's because they bit me super hard in a super big way, and I am scarred. And I intellectually, I can sit here and say, I get like that, they have evolved. That was freaking 25 years ago. Like there's none of the tech is even the same like that. But still, if I walk up to a Soundcraft console, I'm looking to nitpick the things I don't like because they burned me so bad freaking 25 years ago. Like I'm holding a grudge, and I know I'm holding a grudge, but I still can't help it. It's like, I don't like the way these knobs feel. And I don't know about this user interface, and the way that they design that's kind of like and I know it. I'm looking, but I still can't stop myself from not liking it. And I think that's an overt example that I'm aware of, but I still do it. But I know there are little things. It's like, I've used Yamaha consoles forever. When I'm confronted with a user interface that's different than a Yamaha console, I instantly don't like it. Even when objectively I can think to myself, but it's kind of better in some ways, but I still don't like it. Like it's just because it's different. So
I think that's an interesting comparison, because I think that's really not so much your bias is that your familiarity. It's just I'm the same way.
Yeah, you beat me to it, Mac.
I would much rather use a console that I'm comfortable on and familiar with than a console I'm not. I'm like not a Digico fan. I mean, I find them hard to use. Other people find them easy to use. They clearly sound great. They've become the standard of several industries, and for me, they're just hard to use. And it's not confirmation bias. It's that I'm not familiar with them, and I use what I'm familiar with.
That's a really good point, Mac. And Brian, if the bigger test is if you walked into a gig in progress and listened and went, oh, I don't like the sound of this. That must be a Soundcraft console or something like that. As opposed, you know what I mean? Like if you could walk into a gig and say, this sounds weird. It's probably this brand of console. That's more like confirmation bias. Well, if you got over to where you could see front of house and went, aha, I knew it was one of those.
It's like a prejudice.
Well, exactly, and that's you set that up perfectly, because I walk into a concert. Perfect example. I walk into a concert. I don't know anything. I don't know the crew. I don't know what gear they're using. I don't know anything, and I don't like it for whatever reason.
I bet you they're running 48K. They forgot to switch it to 96.
Yeah. Well, and that's just it. Like, if me and 5 other experienced sound people with the same level of experience that I have, we all walk into the same room, we all don't like it. Okay, we'll just make that a case. And then suddenly we are exposed to an entire list of all the gear, all the crew, everything, and it's told to go off in separate rooms and indicate what we think caused the problem. I would bet you there would be 6 completely different answers, because, you know, like for me, it's like if it was a JBL speaker system, I'd be like, yeah, that's why it sounded honky. It's the speakers, you know, and because that's my experience, and that's, you know, then it's like, oh, it sounded honky because of the speaker system, when in reality, it was because the A1 is freaking deaf and like can't hear 3K and just like pushed it on the parametric.
We've all heard great shows on terrible rigs. We've heard terrible shows on great rigs.
Right. But, you know, my indication, my inclination would be to go, you know, or if it sounded like it was like flat and like over processed, and I looked at the A1 and the A1 looked like they were 22 years old, I'd be like, yeah, plug and hound. But if it was like, you know, somebody like our age, my age, I'd be like, huh, interesting. I wonder why they made those choices. Like, I mean, I'm just being honest. Like, that's just, I know my brain. Like, that's,
so your
that's where my brain's
too.
go.
That's what you're telling us here.
Exactly. Yes. Another bias. If you're a kid, you don't know what you're, exactly. But it is. It's another natural bias that, you know, I find myself stepping back very often once some of this is just my own idiosyncrasy, but, you know, I have a thought and then I find myself taking a step back and going, why am I having, and it could just be because I'm right. Like that happens every once in a while, but it's also quite often just like, oh, but it's because, you know, I'm viewing from this lens, or I'm seeing it from, and then it's like, I doesn't mean that I then change my opinion. I might still go, but I still think that, you know, I still think I'm right. But I just think that a lot of these things, you know, we sit there and say, oh, this definitely sounds so much better than this. And it's like, if we really added it all up, especially more experienced folks, it might be, you know, we had a great 3 tours and we always used this microphone on the piano. And consequently, we're just like, that is the perfect microphone for a piano. Don't ever use anything else. And in reality, it was because we were freaking mixing Adele or whatever. And it was a super awesome run of tours, and it was super pleasant, and everybody loved each other, and it was great. And we associate that with, because we used freaking DPA, you know, piano mics or whatever. Literally nobody else has any other opinion. It's just literally every.
I don't have another opinion, but I do have a question. Mm-hmm. This whole topic was sort of brought about by your search for a microphone. And why is the search centered on large diaphragm condenser mics?
See, now that is a great question, because it's like, why do I think inherently, but I do. But why? I mean, it's a great question. Why do I think that a large diaphragm vocal mic is for recording going to inherently be better? And the reality is, because that's what I grew up hearing a lot. I mean, that's, you know, I'm just being like, being honest. It's like, because the reality is, have I demoed on my voice particularly 150 different kinds of microphones, and so I can objectively say, oh yeah, no, for me, a large diaphragm mic works better? No. My experience in coming up in recording studios was, oh, LDC condenser, that's what you use on a vocal.
But over enough time, you probably have heard yourself through a variety of microphones. You may not have had them set up in a row, which would be a way of removing certain time-based bias, like you remember it differently than it actually was. But you do have the cumulative experience of having used microphones, sometimes in different settings, but maybe from front of house, you've used different talkback mics, and you've started to notice that some seem to just work in a way that's differently than the others. So that is something you can observe and get an opinion on over time from. And there I said something.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. And that's why this is interesting to me, because I think that it's, you know, our biases are inextricably linked with completely valid observations that are completely correct. Like it's not, oh,
I'll give you
confirmation bias is completely ruling my opinion on this. It's like, no, a lot of things are indicating my opinion. Go ahead, Lipnick.
I will give you one. If I'm mixing monitors for Tim's over there, and there's feedback, it's definitely coming from the house system and him. So that's one. Yeah. And I'm sure he feels differently. That's one. But here's another.
Lipnick. I'll get you for that.
You. Well, here's something you could probably talk to, because I think there's probably a lot of confirmation bias in system tuning, and I'm okay at system tuning. I will not claim to be a systems engineer. I can do it, but there are a lot of other people that do it much better than me. And I'll tune a system, and a lot of the time everything's great. It's what I expect. And then there's that time where you're like, I thought I fixed that issue. And it's probably operator error on my part. But I think it goes to confirmation bias, which is, hey, I ran the numbers. I looked at smart. I went through my order of operations here. Now I'm mixing the show and all that, or whatever it is, and something comes up that's unexpected. It must be the room and all the people who walked in, and that changed it. Things like that. I did a gig a few weeks ago at a place called the Glass House in San Jose. It's an enormous room with an entire wall of windows, a marble floor, and then some plaster. There is nothing in that room absorbing acoustical energy other than a body or a bag of water, as we like to call them sometimes. And I wrung out the system. And when the audience came in, it completely changed. I've never had it change that much on me. And my confirmation bias was the temperature changed in the room. Like all those factors must have come into play, because I've never seen it do this drastic a shift before, And so I'm just using that as an example, but
well, and that's
now,
valid.
What the reality is what the reality might be completely different than that, but that's my bias.
Oh, well, one of my rooms is a round room with a dome ceiling. It's got about a 2,000 capacity, and it's one of those places where the road crew walks in and goes, "Oh my God." And the lighting guys either go, "Oh, I can do something with this," or they go, "Oh, I am just so screwed." And the thing I always tell the audio, the front of house guy is, you hear a lot of floor bounce in here, and all of those decisions you make anywhere from 1K to about 8K, and you start hacking away at the EQ. When you get the punters in, it's going to change a lot. You're going to wind up, splitting the difference at the very least with all of that stuff. And sometimes they believe me and sometimes they don't, but they find themselves putting it back if they took a bunch of stuff out because they were hearing too much of stuff they didn't like. But it's easy to walk in. There was AV trainer says, what about the bias of being in a famous venue? People, oh, it's got great acoustics, and you walk in and it sounds like an airplane hangar.
Right.
It's got great acoustics for a marching band. It's good for something, right? But it's not good for your show that day. And you're going, okay, how do I deal with this? Or the bias of hearing a system that's been tuned or is being mixed on by a well-known engineer. And, of course, that means that, so do we walk in and think just because, we'll pick on Scoville because he's not here. Scoville's mixing, it's going to be brilliant, right? And you walk in and he's having a lousy day, or the band's having a lousy day, or the venue sucks, or half the rig just went down when you walked in, and, you don't know. Or maybe it's fantastic and you're going, oh, it's because Scoville's there, and you look over there and no, it's actually a whole different person mixing because Scoville had to fly back home that day.
I don't know how many times I've heard, oh, this room was tuned by blah, blah, blah. Put the famous person's name in there, and you go, oh, well, I guess it'll be great then. And you put something through the system, and you're like, really? What happened? Having a bad day that day or something?
Yeah, what was it tuned for?
Yeah, or how did that?
Or who has tuned it since?
Yeah, who's been playing with the controls?
That's what you run into is, oh yeah, this was done by Bob. And then when you listen to it, you go, there's no bloody way Bob did this.
You would not be happy with this.
confirmation bias of all biases in the audio world is probably the hardest to actually control, because early on when I first started doing audio, I'd go in and say, let's listen to a bunch of speakers and put them behind a curtain. I don't want to see what the speakers are. And we would do that, and we would supposedly objectively pick out which one we liked. And recently, probably within 5-6 years, I think, symphony orchestras who are auditioning people to play in them have put the players behind screens, because there was a huge male-female bias going on selecting them. And now there's a lot more women playing in symphony orchestras because of that. And I think that's true of audio. You can't really know what your bias is unless you objectively compare it to something else.
Yep.
A/B it.
Yeah.
Or if you have a favorite mic, put another mic on that same performer at the same time and A/B it.
And
double blinds and
double
null
blind.
tests.
Yeah, and it's double blinds and null tests, which if you're listening to this, don't know what that is, Wikipedia is your friend. We're not here to give you something you can find in Google, but and that's the problem, is that 99.9% of our experience is not a double blind or null test. I mean, that's just reality. Like, that's not the world we live in. And so that then helps us build up all of these, kind of preconceived notions that turn into biases, that turn into whatever. I mean, the thing that I find interesting, and I love that whole story of the putting up a screen because of the heavy emphasis, especially with string players, but I know it was with orchestra players in general, and how suddenly, the proportion of men to women suddenly changed when they couldn't see. And the funny thing is that I would guarantee you that you could take those people who were making those judgment calls and you could strap them down and take the world's most accurate lie detector test ever, and they would absolutely pass I am not judging by their gender, I am not judging from that point, I am not, and they would absolutely pass it.
Well, you can't define what your confirmation is.
Exactly. And it's this, but there's still, I mean, the numbers don't lie. Like, as soon as you put a screen up, the only thing you changed was whether you could see the person or not. And suddenly this proportion changes significantly. Everything else is exactly the same. It's now were some of them, overtly misogynistic or overtly, of course, but I also think that there were probably a number of people that absolutely are not, but their preconceived notion is horn players are dudes, or, woodwind players can be chicks, and so that's okay, or whatever. Like, they have this idea, or all of the great players that they've heard play the oboe have all been men. And that's what they're carrying into the conversation. And so they can't help it. One last little bit, and I'll stop completely dominating the conversation, because if you're not sure whether you've ever had confirmation bias happen to you, I dare anyone on this panel to claim this never happened to them. You turn to control on your console and you absolutely heard it change. You are 100% sure you heard it change, and then you look down and it's freaking bypassed, and you're like, God, and that still happens occasionally to me now. It's because we turn a thing and we know what it's supposed to do, and we just ignore the fact that nothing happened.
But what about the other one where you're looking at the EQ curve on the screen and you realize, oh, that's way too much. I've overdone it. I can't possibly need that much EQ on this thing. You put it back and, oh, that's bad. The idea that you talk yourself out of what you did was correct. You're listening and it's correct. And you look at the screen and go, that can't be right. And yet it is right. As I've always said, if it sounds good, it is good. And you got to stop looking at that screen.
Years ago, I came up with an expression, which is, it sounds like what it sounds like, because you can talk yourself into thinking, oh, this sounds good, or that bass is not distorted, or whatever. But if you're hearing it and the bass is distorted, it's distorted, and so that is kind of a thing to get over your confirmation bias is to actually kind of open your mind up enough to the point where you're actually listening and going, oh yeah, it does sound weird. I have to do something about that.
Yeah, listen critically and don't mix with your eyes. I mean, the classic one is, well, it can't be distorted. I'm not seeing any overload lights in any of the chain. It's like, but maybe it's a blown driver. I mean, there's things that don't have lights on them. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And the flip side of that is when people would go, oh, there's a red light flashing. There's a red light flashing. And my question was, can you hear it? Because there are a lot more opinions about the way people think something sounds than there are quality trained ears to really hear that. And that plays directly into this whole confirmation bias thing, because you and I can go here, we can stand next to each other and have completely different opinions about what we're hearing because it doesn't meet whatever our preconceived or internal pre-built expectation is. And that plays into the perception or lack of perception of one's biases. And, there are two schools of thought. Anybody who's set up a Meyer rig from scratch knows that it doesn't come out of the box sounding like anything. You voice that rig to sound the way it sounds. There are other manufacturers who, what they want is when you put that up and load preset 1, you go, ooh, that sounds mostly right. And those are both valid schools of thought, both in voicing PAs and in marketing them. But, if you're looking to have your button pushed by the way it sounds right away, you probably don't want to buy a Meyer rig.
People will say the same thing about consoles. A Midas console will have this sound. The Yamaha console will have perhaps no sound, and you can adjust it to make it sound that way. This idea of do you like the sound that everyone else? Or D&B subs is another one that people talk about, the way they have a tone to them that if you like it, it's perfect. If you don't like it, you're gonna have trouble. You might have trouble changing it now. I don't know.
You're reaching for a knob.
Yeah.
A lot of microphones are like that. I think of the D112, that's a microphone with a very specific sound, and many mics do. And in fact, coming back to Brian's talk about large diaphragm condenser mics, that's one of the things that people like about them. They're not flat. I mean, you really want a flat mic, those exist too, and you can sculpt the sound or not, but the large diaphragm mics, have a particular sound that people like, and you put it up there and it sounds great. But the other aspect of that is the psychology of that. I mean, try taking a singer that's used to having a big Neumann or whatever, and put a B&K with a pop screen in front of them. And they're like, what is that? And right away, it's messing with their perception of, well, that can't be good. It doesn't look like the big thing that I'm used to singing into. How can it possibly sound good? And it's nothing but the fact that it's a different shape. It might sound fantastic. In fact, often, with mics, one of the sayings I believe in is there's really no bad mic. It's just the wrong mic for that application, and sometimes something that sounded like junk last week and you put it on this particular vocalist and it's magic.
Yeah, there's bad mics. Come on. I mean,
his overall point is valid.
But your point is valid. But as soon as you say that, somebody's going to show up with like a $5 plastic mic that they got on.
Yeah, I'm not talking about that though.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm talking about
professional mics. Yes,
a professional mic with an XLR connector that's not broken or damaged. But no, I know what you're saying. Of course, there's terrible garbage out there, and we don't want people using that stuff. Counterfeit mics, they're just almost nothing you can do will make them sound good. But you get what I'm saying. People, it's about people's perception.
To the point about size.
Yeah,
I mean, lav mics blow my mind. Like MKEs and DPAs and all that stuff are like incredibly flat for the most part, unless they have a little dip up in the presence dip or whatever.
And what are they? A 1/4 inch or smaller capsule?
Yeah, and you want to get a sound.
And they're flatter than pretty much anything else you can get.
Yeah, and you want to get a singer or a piano or something, and they sound amazing.
But along those lines,
really
people
tiny.
talk about the size. They say, well, how can it have good bass if it's so tiny? They're thinking like speakers. You have to have size to move air. With microphones, you don't. It could be,
you don't.
There's mics that are 3 millimeters, tiny little things that sound amazing. Maybe they have a high noise floor, but.
Hey, Tim, were you holding an Octavia there? Is that what that is?
Yes, actually.
Yes,
that was for you.
Thank you. You and I like those mics. I just happen to have a 58 here, and if it hasn't been dropped in water and you didn't know that, right? Let's say this were like, on a festival and it got soaked somehow, and you picked it up the next time, you're like, wow, this sounds like terrible. I was almost going to use a curse word there. This sounds really bad. A couple of things one thing I want to say is that I can think of one instance where confirmation bias is actually good in our industry, which is when someone's on, let's say you're mixing monitors on wedges on stage, and someone on stage goes, hey, can you turn me up? And you reach for the knob, and before you even turn it, they go, that's perfect. Now, I'm sure we've all been guilty of, and you should admit it if you have, that you've actually pretended to turn the knob. That's a little different. But that's sort of confirmation bias. I don't know if it's in reverse or just as a useful tool.
True story. I acquired the nickname Ike the Teeny Turner because of making really small adjustments on monitor requests at one point, years and years and years ago.
You need a shirt.
5,000 years ago.
Ike, you need a shirt with that on it. That's great.
Ike the Teeny Turner. There's so much to unpack in there, but we're not going to. But yeah, and when you start talking about dealing with musicians on stage as a monitor engineer, understanding your artists' biases help you do your job better. It's like understanding that they may hear something differently than you, and it's because, I mean, the number of times that I won't even tell stories because it'll bore everybody, but we all have had, a particular artist and they use a microphone. You cannot change that microphone, period, because that's their microphone. And as soon as you make them walk up to a different microphone, they're just like, this isn't going to work even though objectively everyone would be like, this one's way better. It sounds way better. Her voice is way better for this. It's just like, no, like I've done 4,000 shows perfectly on this SM58 or whatever it is. And I don't want to ever, I just don't want,
I don't think that's so much confirmation bias or anything of that nature. That's customer service. That's giving your artist what they need to do their job, and give them an easy day at the office. You're going to have an easy day at the office too. You don't want to mess that up. But I think that's a different thing than deciding that you or someone else has a particular inherent bias toward a particular piece of gear or against a particular piece of gear or brand. Just because.
Well, you could also always hide a different mic inside of the one that they've requested.
which I've actually,
we've all done that. Yeah, absolutely.
I've put DPAs in Shure 55 housings.
Yeah, there's the classic case. Yep. Yeah, Judy Collins travels with 5 451s with CK5 heads, and she tries each one out at sound check to decide which one of those 5 she's going to use tonight.
And as the sound engineer on her shows, you go, awesome. That is absolutely the right way to do this. This is the way it should be done. Now, I will say, we keep circling back to confirmation bias as if it's the only one. It's just as much of a bias of I've done 4,000 shows on an SM58 and I don't want to change. Like that is, I am biased towards this microphone because it has carried me through 4,000 perfect shows. And I am associating this microphone with 4,000 perfect shows. Obviously, that's not inherently valid, but like you said, from a customer service standpoint, understanding those things, and then also understanding that you may be overcoming some things that an artist inherently can't help themselves. They're like, the sound company I cut my teeth on had all the wedges were 15 and a 1-inch horn, which was, everybody was used to double 12s and a 2, like that was the thing. And the number of times that we would haul out the 15s and a 1, and they're like, oh, this isn't going to work. Like, this is never going to work. This is never going to work. And then we had to like put out a couple of them and wind them up. And like, they were great sounding wedges for what they were. But we had to overcome this oh, this can't possibly sound like what I want it to sound like because it's not a double 12 and a 2. Like this just can't. Every once in a while, they were right. Like they needed a sound that wedge was not going to produce. But the overwhelming majority of the time, it was just all I've ever used is double 12s and a 2, and that's what it's got to be. And then because we didn't have any in stock, we then had to work extra hard to kindly say, well, you want to listen to it? Just, I don't think it's going to get loud enough.
It's because so many of us have been out there and been lied to by the sound companies saying,
sure,
it'll be just fine. It'll be fine.
Oh, you'll like it. It was great.
No
The band
problem.
loved it
It'll be
last
great.
week.
And you're like, oh, I never used that before.
Or they
I don't
said
know.
that they were going to bring. They said that they were going to bring what you asked for, and then brought what they got.
So that's why you hold them to the fire. You go, no, you said you were going to bring this.
Well,
that's why I want.
That's what the rider is all about, right? I mean,
Exactly.
You're
no surprises.
About the microphones reminds me of a story Scoville told me years ago when he was working with Tom Petty. He said he wanted to try a new microphone, and he brought it out there and he said, let's get this new microphone. I think it's going to sound better on you. And Petty said, that's what my last sound guy said just before I fired him. But he eventually got it to happen. And the way he did it was he just put the mic out there, didn't say a word. And Petty came out and sound checked and, hey, this sounds great. And that's what they used from then on. So some of it was just, don't ask, just do it.
There's a little bit more to that story. And
Yeah,
that is
it
that
involves
he took his luggage with him to the sound check and put it right in front of the console. I can be fired or I can quit, but at least try the mic. But, and the rest of the story was, he goes, if I've got to listen to the rest of the band bleed through the artist's vocal mic, he said, it's got to sound good. And since the mic never moves, you can then time align all of those sources back to Tom's vocal mic. Mm-hmm. And that was the secret, was having a mic that was capable of had enough phase response accuracy that you could do that.
Yeah, and a perfect example of what doing whatever it takes to overcome someone's inherent bias, because that's what needed to happen in that case, and you really didn't want to have to spend an hour and a half explaining to Tom Petty everything about phase and leakage and pattern control. He knows
what he likes. He knows what the sound is in his head, and he's going to walk out there, and that's what he wants to hear. So
and ultimately, ultimately in that particular case, it wasn't really. I mean, Tim, you explained it perfectly, but it wasn't really so much that microphone sounded better with that voice. It was that microphone sounded way better in that situation objectively, and Scoville knew that, and he knew that this is going to give a better overall result. You've just never tried it before. But, it's very interesting how our preconceived notions are part of our biases, but also just some of it's just my experience. Like I've always had good experience with this. So.
Yeah, the collective experience, like what we talked about before.
Yep.
It's not just one data point, it's tons. And maybe it starts at a certain point and you've got some bias, your first encounter with whatever speakers, whatever mic, and so on. And that sets your tone. But then over time, you get a lot more data points to add to that. I mean, it's interesting though, that, bringing an experience to it, it's a kind of bias all itself, but for a good reason most of the time.
When you're just starting out in the business, there's just so many things that you don't know. And so unfortunately, so many people who also don't know who are advising you and saying, you got to try this. This is going to fix everything.
This is the only way to do this. Is the only way to do.
And you don't know any better to go, okay.
A couple of things. So to the Judy Collins with 5 identical vocal mics is years and years ago, I just came to peace with the idea that people, particularly artists, can hear stuff that I can't hear. And I mean, do we know beyond the shadow of a doubt that 5 SM58s are identical every day? Or is it humidity? Or because there are variations. Carl's a manufacturer, that there's a plus or minus 5% or whatever the variation is in manufacturing tolerances in those things. And maybe on day X, mic number 4, the diaphragm was a little tighter because of the humidity or whatever. So I don't discount that stuff. One time
you have to give into their confirmation bias.
Right. Don't buy a mic that was built on Monday or Friday.
Or or they can hear something that I can't hear. And the other, one time I finished one of my few corporate AV installations. I finished it and everybody was, sounds great. And one woman on the staff said, yeah, it sounds good, but there's like a high pitched thing going on, like 16K or something like that. And I'm like, I lost those frequencies years ago, but I'm not going to discount what you're saying. And there was something it was, DSP mixer and all this other stuff. And there's all kinds of opportunities for something like that to get in there. So, I could have said, I can't hear it. You're full of shit. But it's like, I realized that, I used the first bad word in the broadcast. But anyway, I just think that people can hear stuff that I can't hear and or feel stuff that I can't feel or whatever. And
years ago, doing frequency coordination, I gave up on saying, no, there's no interference. It sounds fine to a monitor engineer because they can hear better than dogs. And so whatever the monitor engineer says, I'll fix it because it's them. I have to make
and they may not be describing it right, but there's something wrong. And
that's a great point.
Monitors. Speaking of monitors, years ago in the 80s, I was doing monitors for this band, and we got called at very, very short notice for a rehearsal in this sort of jam space, sort of recording studio. And I'd been in there once before, and I knew that there was just like 2 trainer column speakers or something for monitors. And I looked around the shop that I was in. I was sharing it with like 4 other sound guys. We kind of pooled our resources. And I said, I got to bring a monitor for the singer. And I looked around, and the only thing I could find was this ceiling acoustic tile speaker thing. It was like the size of a ceiling tile, styrofoam baffle kind of thing with some drivers on the back and an aluminum frame and some pigtails hanging off it that somebody had brought us for a demo. I went, that's a speaker. And I brought that and I propped it up on a chair in front of her microphone. And I hooked up the wires to the pigtails. And it was set up. We get started. We get into the downbeat of the first song. And we're about 2 bars in. And the singer goes, wait a minute. I don't have a monitor. And I go up to her and I go, is it because you can't see your monitor, or is it because you can't hear your monitor? And she goes, what do you mean? And I go, that thing on the chair right in front of you, which is, it's like this high instead of like, right on the floor. I go, that thing on the chair right in front of you is a speaker and your voice is in it. She goes, oh, okay. And then boom, they went and that was it. They were fine. No level changes, no Ike the Teeny Turner at all. Just away we went. So, in that case, she needed to see something that was black and wedge shape on the floor in front of her.
Yep.
So,
yeah, which is really a great example of exactly what we're talking about. It's and so we're coming up on an hour, and I'm going to put this one back in the hopper again because I think there's so many more aspects of this, but. This is the thing that keeps me up at night, or that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and that is just because what she saw changed what she heard doesn't mean what she heard was wrong. And like what we hear is so complicated and so tied into so many other factors that aren't the tubes in the side of our heads. It's all of our experience and all of our preconceived notions and all of our biases and what mood we're in and, all of these things. And it literally changes what we hear. And the interesting thing is that we all humans are subject to this. And so we all, like when we talk about the subjectivity of sound and, how everyone hears things a little differently, that's not all physical. That's not all like, oh, we have different shaped ears. It's also, you're bringing in your experience and your knowledge and your, the things that some of which are helping you hear things with more detail and better, some of which may be hurting you. As a musician, I know that many times I have heard detail coming off the stage that's not coming off the stage because I'm looking at the guitar player and I know what he's playing. And because I know what he's playing, I can hear it. And then the second that I stop looking at the stage, all of a sudden I realize, no, I can't. You know, it's like, you know, I'm carrying that experience as a guitar player into it. And it's like, if I actually avert my eyes and don't look, all of a sudden now I can't make out the notes because I'm using my eyes to hear the music. So it's, you know, it's an endless conversation that we could talk about forever. John, you put in like a half a cent worth in. Is there anything you'd love to add? Yep, perfect.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing where, as you said, people's own interpretation, their own experience of the sound may be tied to how visual a person they are as compared to how oral a person they are. And that started me thinking about some of my experiences where I've done a lot of mixing for picture. And the whole construct and the whole way that you assemble your mix changes when you get that video monitor in front of you and you're watching some of the changes happening. And if you listen to a soundtrack that's coming straight out of a movie without the visual feedback, it could sound way, way, way different. And maybe incredibly unbalanced, because there's cues you get by seeing a visual that don't necessitate the kind of level that you would put in for an audio only cue. So there's a kind of a situation where you're looking at a different kind of bias that's happening because you're getting feedback from other sources. Mixing for picture without the picture is crazy. It doesn't work. You can't. It's weird.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and it's you know, it's a form of bias. It's another piece of input. It's another part of the puzzle that isn't what we're hearing. You know, it isn't the vibe. It's not the vibration of our eardrums. It's a different thing that is changing the way that we perceive something, whether that's strictly speaking a bias or not, whatever.
Well, there's a certain synesthesia at play there, where your mind is also filling in blanks in the visuals, and the visual is filling in blanks or reinforcing something in the audio. You know, they're working together.
Are we daring to suggest that what the lighting guys do matters? I'm just wondering.
Oh, hell no.
No. Don't go there, Carl.
Only if you can find someone going home whistling the lighting.
I don't really mix for music anymore, but when I did, I found that closing my eyes was a very important part of the job. Was my ability to just listen to what was happening was much better with my eyes closed than when I was with my eyes open.
Nobody accused you of falling asleep?
I might have been asleep.
Driving is very important to keep your eyes closed.
One glaring example of what Brian's talking about is, you know, if you're working with a popular artist who has a big hit song, and it doesn't matter how bad the sound is, if there's certain audible cues that come off the stage that say, this is the hit song, then everybody in the audience is going to go, oh yeah, the hit song, because they've basically got it recorded in their head because they've listened to it 75,000 times in their car or their you know, the radio in the kitchen or whatever, right? So it triggers, it's kind of what you were talking about looking at the guitar player versus listening to the guitar player. As long as they get some cue that says the hit song, they're going, you know? So
there's another side to this that you hear sometimes is that when the artist does the hit song every night, night after night, and the front of house sound guy knows the song so well that he actually undermixes the vocal. And that's something that's quite common.
And
then again, when the audience is singing along, how do you know it's undermixed? You've got 12,000, 15,000 people in the arena going, "Sweet Caroline."
Wah wah wah. Yeah, and I've had that experience where it's like, you know, my mix is pretty solid, and then all of a sudden they play the hit, and like the vocal is now buried because everybody's singing or everybody's cheering or everybody's whatever. And then I've also learned in that environment, it's like, okay, my mix was fine. It's still fine. They can still hear it, even though I can't hear it. Like, and I'm talking about situations where I'm like mixing one-offs, where maybe I don't know the music that well. Maybe I don't know the hit that well, but the people that are there do. And they're like, they hear the vocal just fine, even though objectively I'm out there going, y'all just need to shut up because I can't hear her at all. Like I hear drums and some low end, and I think a guitar, and I can't hear. Like 2 minutes ago, that vocal was sitting perfect, and now it's gone. And if I change I have to kind of just sit back and go, everyone can hear it fine, even though they can't objectively. I know that they perceive it. Like no one walks by me at the end of the night and goes, everything was great except when she hit the hit and then we couldn't hear her anymore. Everybody heard her just fine because they were singing the song in their head. We're over an hour, and I like to keep these things short and fun so we can circle back to the same topics over and over and over again and recycle them until they're dead. That's what we do here. So we've touched on this. We talked a lot about confirmation bias. I think the next time I throw this in the hopper, I'll literally find a different bias and we'll talk about that one, because there's literally like 40 or 50 of these things that color the way that we perceive things, including visual bias and sensory bias and all of these things that color things. I want to thank everybody for being here and joining us. Thanks for the noobs and the olds. And thank Andy Broughton for co-hosting, even though I dominated the conversation like I always do, because that's what I do.
Why we love you, Brian.
It's something, I don't know. And I'm hoping that Andy has the fabulous bean footage ready to roll, and you can roll that fabulous bean footage. Wave goodbye, everyone. Goodbye.
Yeah, well, that's like just your opinion.